11, so we can start. Good morning and welcome everyone to this talk by Dr. K.V. Subramanian on Indianizing Indian thought. Dr. Subramanian is formerly the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Is currently a professor at the Indian School of Business. He's a PhD from Chicago Booth and a top-ranking IIT-IIM alumnus, and he has brought several ideas to implement welfare programs effectively. His push for the behavioral economics of nudge is acknowledged for its potential to bring behavioral change to India. And his idea of thali-nomics, what a common person pays for a vegetarian or non-vegetarian thali, has been acclaimed to be the Indian Big Mac Index. Dr. Subramanian has also been confirmed with the Distinguished Alumnus Award by his alma maters, IIT Kanpur and IIM Calcutta. Apart from being the youngest Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Subramanian is among the youngest to receive this honor from his alma maters. And his research in banking, law, and finance, innovation, and economic growth, and corporate governance has been published in the world's leading journals. Without further ado, over to Dr. Subramanian.
Very good morning, and thank you very much to you all for inviting me to share my thoughts. This is, as I've mentioned, in the brief as well. This is part of a larger agenda, research agenda, part of which was started, when I wrote the 2020 economic survey. Those of you who are interested should go and read that survey. But more broadly, this is part of actually my sort of my own reading. While of course, having spent time at the University of Chicago and in the United States, I've certainly been exposed to all the literature that the West has to offer. But I've also been fortunate enough to read a lot of the Indian literature as well. And I've always believed that a scholar must really develop a very rounded view. I've certainly not believed that literature is only what is written in English, especially coming from India with so much diversity and such such rich literature written in Sanskrit and in and in other languages. And Sanskrit, by the way, is actually one of the oldest languages known to mankind, possibly as old as some of the other. And my own mother tongue, Tamil, as well. The oldest language. So what I'm going to actually share with you is part of ongoing research, which will eventually lead to at least one book, maybe more, on these ideas. So that's what I'm going to share. One more thought, and this is something which is actually, while writing the economic survey, the 2020 economic survey, and which had carried liberal references to a lot of the Indian literature. I actually also reminisce that during the decade that I lived in the United States and traveled all over the world, one thing that struck me was whenever anybody, anywhere in the world started to ask some basic questions about human life, the country that they thought about was always India. And I think many times, especially those of us who are educated, and especially those that are English educated, typically do not recognize our strengths as well. And this is also part of an effort, therefore, to make sure that we value what is our strengths as well. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me. I'll have a presentation. After that, I'd be very happy to answer questions. Let me just share my screen. Yeah, I hope it's visible. So let me start by something that intrigued me a lot. There was this research that was published by this agency, Pew Research, which showed about that 97% Indians believed God is important in their life. And this was significantly lower than that for advanced economies. When I looked at the proportions for the advanced economies, many of them were around 60%. And as I mentioned, actually, I've already preambled through my own experiences, especially writing the economic survey, the 2020 economic survey. This question, especially from an economic perspective, has been something that I've been reflecting upon. Should India just, mimic or adopt Western culture, values, and institutions? institutions, especially given how rich we have been as a culture and as a society. So some details, if you look at, this is not just in terms, if you look by various religions as well, Hindus 98%, general population is 97%. This is again from the Pew Research. Muslims 91, Christians 98, Sikhs 94. Only the Buddhists were a little lower at 67, Jains 99. So there is actually a very large, even across various religious strata, the belief in God in India actually seems to be much higher than that in advanced economies. And this is something which this kind of research did not exist in, let's say, in a 1990 or maybe in a 1950. But if it existed, it would be very interesting to compare the time series, how it would have been in the 1990s or 1980s. And I don't have that data because that research does not exist. But anecdotally, I think this is something that is quite specific to India, because this salient difference for India, I don't think is because of material prosperity, because historically, even when India was extremely prosperous, and I will give you evidence of that, in the talk, Indians believed as much in religion, and Sanatan Dharma was a way of life, not dogmas, that change with material prosperity. And that's one thing that, as somebody born with a scientific temper, somebody who went to engineering and learned the natural sciences, which inherently imbibes scientific temper in you, these are coming from a person who has basically always respected scientific temper. And the Sanatan Dharma as a way of life and not dogmas is something that I've actually come to learn about in this path of discovery. A question that I think is quite material, especially for India, as India celebrates its 75th year and looks forward to India at 100, is, will economics that is departed from the socio-cultural aspects of a society, will it deliver equitable and sustained development? Sustained development, even more important, especially in the context of challenges like climate change, and other aspects. In other words, can one do well by trying to fit a square peg into a round hole? Or can economic development contrary to a society's DNA be salutary? Which then begs the question: what is India's DNA? And I think that's what I'm going to try and spend, significant amount of time on, trying to reflect on India's DNA. I will speak on the economic aspects as well, but the economic aspects actually really stem from the socio-cultural aspects, and which I will, talk about. I had the the privilege of taking of sitting through some classes at the University of Chicago's Divinity School, and especially because comparative religion is something that interested me. I used to sit through these classes, and therefore, I've had the ability to sort of assimilate, the way West progressed versus how, and having read, many of the Indian literature as well, how India had been historically. So what I'm presenting actually is based on a lot of this very rich discovery that has happened over about 2 decades. In India's DNA, actually, for me, is a milieu of creativity and liberalism underlying its economic thought. Liberalism that actually, that led to tolerance, to creativity, and to prosperity. Now, you have to be, careful, and I will actually, show this. A lot of us today, when we think about liberalism or liberal ideals, we use the definition that has been provided to us by the West. But I think, these ideals have very much existed in India, as I will try and illustrate through, through samplings from various parts of the Indian literature. The thesis that I'm going to advocate using this, sampling of literature in the next few slides is that the liberal ideals that underlie India's society led to a tolerance level of tolerance that was actually that the West can't even imagine about, and that led to mind-boggling creativity and prosperity, and that's something which all of us have to actually reflect and understand. So let me first start with the liberalism to tolerance part. Let me show you some sampling from the literature on this. This is from the Maha Upanishad. In many speeches, Many of you would have seen these last two words being used, or maybe in your homes as well, you would have heard this word, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. But I think it is very important to understand, many people talk about these two words, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, without actually, recognizing the full context in which it was spoken about in the Maha Upanishads. In the Maha Upanishad, the shloka that comes is, Ayam nijaha paro veti ganana laghu chetasam udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. And let me, because this is Sanskrit, some of you may be familiar, others may not be, and let me just explain wherever I think is necessary. In the interest of time, I'll not, go into each of the explanations, but this one being very critical, I am nijaha. Nijaha means actually mine. I am nijaha, this is mine. Paro veti, that is not mine. Ganana is calculation. I am nijaha paro veti ganana. These are calculations made by laghu, means small. Laghu chetasam. Chetana is consciousness. So this kind of calculation, small-minded calculations that this is mine and that is not mine, is made by those with actually a limited consciousness. In contrast, and that's the second line here, udara charitanam. Udar means actually a very, very expanded consciousness, or a very broad-minded consciousness. Udara charitanam. So, broad-minded, broad-charactered people, for them, udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam, that the entire world is a family. And I think this idea that it is basically the large-heartedness that leads to the entire world as a family, India advocated this thought. No other civilization, had the depth to be able to advocate this kind of thought. Look at, another example of this. This is from the Garuda Purana. Sarvesham mangalam bhuyat, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. Let all people live with pleasure everywhere. Let all people live without diseases. Let everyone feel themselves secure, and let none have sorrow at any time. This is not about actually, prosperity or lack of disease or fear for my clan or my country. This is a prayer for all of humanity. And that is something that actually has existed in the Garuda Purana from time immemorial. And that's, again, a second example of the kind of, deep liberal thought that actually, and this is where I would actually define the Western conception of liberalism, and having read Max Weber, and on, his idea of basically the Protestant ethic and how democracy and capitalism in the West evolved from the Protestant ethic, and oftentimes liberal ideals in the West are thought about the separation of state from, from religion, or state from church. But the Indian ideal of liberalism was of inclusiveness, of infinite inclusiveness, not clannish, where actually I pray only for my clan, but for the entire of humanity. And that is basically where the fundamental distinction that first we have to make. Second, actually, and this is something, again, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of my own discovery, if there is one document that I've been enormously influenced by, in my own life, actually, and being able to live a happy, fruitful life, it is the Bhagavad Gita. And I'm going to quote here from the 18th chapter, Shloka 63, which actually, again, conveys, what we saw in the previous slide, where macro ideas of liberalism. Now here, look at it at the micro, which is individual level. So here, and I'm just focusing on the last three words here. Yathechasi tatha kuru. Yathechasi, that means what you feel like, tatha kuru. Okay. Now this is the Bhagavad Gita has 18 chapters. At the end of the Bhagavad Gita, having told, to Arjuna, Krishna has basically advocated the three paths, Gyan Marg, Karma Marg, and Bhakti Marg, all kinds of, knowledge he's given him. And then says, at the end of this says, thus has knowledge been declared to you by me. I've given you all the knowledge, reflect on it fully and act as you like. Act as you like. Now, remember, this is basically a conversation between supposedly, the Lord himself and a disciple. Even the Lord is not saying that you have to act this way. Even Krishna does not threaten Arjuna with any consequences. Oh, if you don't do as I tell you, actually, these will be the consequences. No, he's not saying that. Even Krishna does not threaten Arjuna about the consequences should Arjuna exercise his free will and judgment. He just says, you should do this. This is how, if wise people would behave. But even God is basically asking humans to exercise discretion and make a choice. So, as I showed you in the previous slide, that was basically at the macro level, inclusive, infinite inclusiveness. When you look at the individual level, micro level of an individual, again, the liberal, the thought to actually let the disciple decide for himself or herself after having, shown him the way that this is how, you should do. But if you want to act in a different way, definitely your free will to actually go ahead and act. And that again, symbolizes a kind of liberal thought to me, in fact, this symbolizes the pinnacle of liberal thought at the, at the level of an individual. So that was basically at the micro and macro level on liberalism and tolerance, actually for dissonant thoughts. Now let's focus on creativity. And I think oftentimes, especially those who are from the liberal arts actually may appreciate some of these aspects of creativity far more than those of us who actually were more into engineering or sciences. But there's something which actually I've been able to really marvel at. So if you see, and this is so palindrome, many of us know, is basically a sentence that is actually it's read the same way backward or forward. The sentence, able was I saw Elba. This is often quoted as a great example of a palindromic sentence in English. Now, note, it's quoted as a great example of a palindromic sentence in English, that as it can be read in reverse too. Now think about the idea that is underlying this is, able was I saw Elba. Nothing very profound about I was able, I saw Elba. Okay, so if you read it forward or backward, it basically reads the same. It's a 6-word palindromic sentence. Now look at the contrast. The Ramakrishna Viloma Kavyam. This is by Devagya Surya Pandit. It's a 400-word palindromic composition. Where is 6 words? There are 400 words. And look at the able was I saw Elba. Nothing profound in that. I saw X, I saw Y. What is so profound about that? In contrast, this 400-word palindromic composition, it's called Ramakrishna Viloma Kavyam. Viloma basically means opposite. So when you read it forward, it is the story of Rama. When you read it backward, it is the story of Krishna. The two most important characters, in sort of, Indian mythology, Rama and Krishna. It's a composition that is of 400 words. 6 words versus 400 words. It's like almost 60, 70 times more words. And look at the ideas there. You read it forward, it is the story of Rama. You read it backward, it is the story of Krishna. I'll give you just a couple of examples here. So this particular sentence, I just picked it up from this Viloma Kavyam, which is Tam Bhusuta Mukti Mudarahasam Vandayeto Lavya Bhavam Dayashri. I pray to Sita, the incarnation of Lakshmi, who's affectionate towards a smiling lover, who's Sita's son. This is basically is the story of Rama. Read backward, basically, Shri Yadavam, you can actually follow it if you want. It is actually a palindromic composition. Shri Yadavam, Bhavya Latoya Devam, Samharada Mukti Muta Subhutam. The teachings of Gita bestowed upon us by Lord Krishna, who draws people towards him with his benevolence, destroy evil, and are close to our heart. Now, just marvel at the creativity. 6 words, and it is called great, as a great example of palindromic, versus 400 words, a one-liner with nothing profound. I saw X, I saw Elba. What's the big difference? I saw Subbu, I saw someone else, versus I saw Elba. And X is able, Y is able, someone else is able. Nothing profound about it. In contrast, take the idea, it's an innocuous idea versus the, two talismanic characters, one, read forward versus read backwards. Just reflect upon the profoundness and the depth. And this is why, especially to you youngsters, actually, from someone who's actually, basically read this, has gone to the same top universities in India and in the world, and so from someone like me telling you the kind of wealth that exists in the Indian culture, to basically reflect upon the profoundness and the depth. I think this is just one example. Down south, I'll give you another example. This is Tirukural. It is basically in my mother tongue Tamil. Tiru means holy. Kural means concise or abridged. And again, look at the creativity and of this composition. I'm going to give you some examples. Each chapter in the Tirukural has exactly 10 couplets, So if you're reading shloka number or couplet number 53, it's from the 6th chapter, because 5 tens are 50. So 5 chapters done, 53 means it's the 6th chapter. Each of the 1,330 couplets contains exactly 7 words. Imagine over 1,330 couplets. Every one of those couplets contains exactly 7 words. The Tirukural starts from the first letter R, first letter in Tamil, which is R, and ends with the last letter in the Tamil alphabet. And what does it cover? It covers everything that a human needs to live life king size. Basically, there are 3 parts of the Tirukural. It's called Agattupal, Porulpal, and Kamattupal. For those of you who understand maybe from the south, Pal is actually means milk, but it also is interpreted as essence. So Agattupal is basically about stuff relating to material aspect, relating to spiritual aspects. Porulpal is about material aspects, and Kamattupal is about desires. And this is basically about so 3 key parts, but written with basically each chapter having 10 couplets, each of those couplets having exactly 7 words, and starting with the first letter and ending with the last letter, and so much. Actually, I have liberally quoted reference Tirukural in the 2020 economic survey and other economic surveys as well. So, but there's a sea of knowledge here, to the extent that Avvaiyar, who's actually a very famous poet of Tamil Nadu, basically describes Tirukural, says that, Tiruvalluvar, who's the one who wrote it, in around 500 BC, Tiruvalluvar took wisdom equal to the water in the 7 seas and compressed it into a mustard seed. That is what this, of course, very, a poet basically is using that, parallel, so the metaphor so well, but the water of 7 seas compressed into a mustard seed. That basically tells you about the creativity that there is, that's existed in Indian thought. Now, that's just a couple of examples of the creativity. Now, let me get on to the economic aspects of prosperity. And the reason I have covered all this is because, in any society, the economics cannot be departed from its society, from the socio-cultural aspects. And therefore, understanding that is incredibly important. So the Indian, economic thought actually emerged from these fundamentals of liberal thought, which actually enabled tolerance and led to mind-boggling creativity that the West has, basically doesn't even have 1% of it yet, and led to enormous prosperity as well. And I'm saying this based on facts. Let's make sure that basically there is no, emotiveness in this. So first, on the prosperity. So look at this chart. This is the first chart, by the way, in the 2020 economic survey, drawn from Angus Madison's work published by the Oxford University, which shows, of course, the time here on x-axis is time, but it is not linear because, the first unit covers 1,000 years. And after that, you see actually, a few units that cover 100 years. And then actually it starts, so the units of time actually start getting compressed as you proceed along the x-axis. So, the area of dominance here is not really, if you just take the area, that doesn't capture the full time aspect of time, but it is, quite interesting. You can see up until 1750 AD, and that is about this point, which is basically 3/4 of known economic history. India was by far the largest contributor to world GDP. And in each one of those years, for 17 and a half centuries, India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP. And this is, by the way, these are facts. This is not somebody, talking about Sony ke chidiya, etc. This is fact evidence provided by Angus Madison. And those who actually say, oh, it was because of population, and this may come up in Q&A as well, in these societies, agrarian societies, population was endogenous. People moved to those places where there was prosperity. So I think you have to keep that in mind as well, and not dismiss it just based on oh, that was just an aspect of population. And unlike today, for instance, where you could basically go and live in a desert as well, that was not possible given the technology that was available there. So don't dismiss it just based on because population is endogenous. So another important fact, most of us actually would aspire and say, oh, India should become as prosperous as the, and as prosperous as, let's say, the United States. Having lived there for a decade, actually, I've seen some of the prosperity there. USA actually has been the largest contributor to world GDP for about half a century. And at its, and on average, it has contributed about 28% to world GDP in this half a century period approximately. But then compare and actually again reflect on it. India, was this dominant power for 17 and a half centuries, which is 35 times longer. Now, that kind of dominance does not happen by accident. Again, that kind of dominance does not happen by accident. It comes only because of the kind of model, the economic model itself, which I will actually expatiate on significantly. It comes because of the kind of model that is followed, and that's what I'm going to go into now. So if you go and look at, the Rig Veda, by the way, for instance, is the oldest document known to mankind. And in the Rig Veda, there is a hymn that comes, which is called Shri Suktam. Many of you, might recite it, or your parents or your grandparents might recite it. I recite it. And so, I understand the significance of that. But in the Vedas, actually, there were these 4 purusharths, actually, or 4 noble pursuits that were talked about. Those 4 noble pursuits were dharma, arth, kama, moksha, of which arth basically was, basically that's material wealth. So India was not a society that basically abhorred wealth or wealth creation. It is only the 40 odd years of socialist economy, which basically when the then Prime Minister said, don't ever utter the word profit in front of me, it's a dirty word. And I'll speak about this later. Socialism itself as an idea is actually an import. It is not, it came from the West, especially, Karl Marx was German, for instance. So India's DNA, as I'm going to show in the next few slides, was always one that actually enabled, or was what one that enabled moral capitalism by marrying the hand of ethics with the hand of the invisible enterprise, artha. So it was a marriage of artha and dharma, 2 of the noble pursuits. And think about it actually as the following: think about the metaphor of a river, and actually it's very important why dharma becomes so crucial. This metaphor will help you understand that when a river is well banked, the water flows into areas where where it creates prosperity, enables a lot of good crops to be grown, and so creates prosperity. But the same river, if the banks are broken, then water goes helter-skelter and creates a lot of destruction. So dharma is like that, those banks that enables the flow of prosperity, of economic activity for enhancing welfare rather than destroying welfare. And the global financial crisis actually, which has led to a lot of rethinking on economic models, actually is an illustration of the banks of the river being broken, of rapacious capitalism, and not moral capitalism. Rapacious capitalism basically, leading to a lot of destruction. So this is, the Indian model of moral capitalism is actually quite apt for basically sustained prosperity. That's why even if other countries don't implement it, at least India must be reflecting on it, because that is basically what we have gotten, and that is what made us so prosperous. So it is basically that, the marriage of these two that leads to the fulfilling of material desires, and then, leading to liberation from, and which is something that India always actually, focused on as well. But this sort of stereotypical depiction of Indian thought as only being concerned with moksha, liberation, afterlife, not about the life here and now, is actually a stereotype. Because, as you will see, the Indian thought has been as much about moksha, liberation, as about desires here as well, fulfillment of desires here. So that stereotyping actually is not quite right. And when you start reading this, you can actually, start appreciating it. So when you take what was India's model, was actually comprised of these. The economic model, as I mentioned, it flowed from the liberal ideals that led to tolerance and then led to mind-boggling creativity. But on the economic side, basically, there were 5 main pillars: markets and private enterprise. That is why, in my term as the CEA, I've pushed for privatization, significantly, and the change in the Indian economic policy, Atmanirbhar Bharat policy, that, that except for 4 or 5 strategic sectors, government will get out of business, is actually drawn from, India's DNA, which has always been one that has enabled private enterprise, markets and private enterprise. It's basically, Adam Smith called it the invisible hand of markets. The fact that, you have bread on, on the breakfast table in the morning is not because of the compassion of or the benevolence of the baker, but because the greed of the baker, or well-directed greed. And that's basically what, as you'll see, a lot of the Indian literature talked about it much longer, about 2 millennia before Adam Smith, advocated these ideas. Second, Indian DNA was never one to abhor wealth or wealth creation. It is only the socialist thought, a lot of residual of which still remains, in India, which basically leads to abhorrence of wealth and wealth creation. But India always emphasized wealth that is actually generated by doing good, by value add. Those of you who are learning economics will appreciate that there's a difference between rent seeking versus value creation. Wealth created by adding value is something that Indian thought always, encouraged. But rent extraction was always something that actually, was discouraged. And sustainable growth. Actually, if you think about climate change, it is actually, in some way, if you grow, if you create wealth by destroying the climate, that is actually a model of rapacious capitalism, of rent extraction, not one where you're adding value necessarily. But the Indian model was one that focused on sustainable growth, and I'll give instances of that. When you go a little bit more down at the micro level, property rights, any capitalistic model at its center is property rights. It actually, epicenter is property rights. And this is something that the Indian thought always respected, in contrast to the rapacious, thought that actually had prevailed. And I'll give you examples of that in the Western paradigm. And finally, role of state, taxes and public goods. And the thought that, so these are the aspects that I'll cover on the economic side. India's traditional economic thinking emphasized enabling markets and eliminating obstacles to economic activity. So Arthashastra, which was written 2 millennia back, Adam Smith coined the idea that, invisible hand of market, the fact that the baker's greed actually is what puts bread on the table, which is essentially the idea that private enterprise is what leads to wealth creation in society. This idea, Arthashastra actually advocated 2 millennia before Adam Smith. So while, most, and I've learned economics myself, at the University of Chicago. But, if most people will regard Adam Smith as the father of economics, but now having learned so much, if you ask me, I would say Kautilya is actually the father of economics, because these ideas were very much there, 2 millennia back. And it's not just me saying it, David Spengler, in this book in 1971, published by the Duke University Press, He says, and I quote from there, it is in the Arthashastra that economic discussion was most highly developed, much more fully than one finds it in classical Greek economics. And, again, I'm quoting from Spengler's book, where basically he says, Kautilya said, the root of wealth is economic activity, and lack of it brings material distress. Just reflect on it. This is, I think, what any economist today would actually, say it, but this was said 2 millennia back, that root of wealth is economic activity, and lack of it brings material distress. Absent fruitful economic activity, both current prosperity and future growth are in danger of destruction. This was said 2 millennia back by Kautilya. And crucially, in the context of this ease of doing business that we talk about, the World Bank started these ease of doing business rankings 2 decades back. Interestingly, that has also been subject to rent extraction, and many of you might have followed some of the the controversies on that. But the fact that the king should work to remove all obstructions to economic activity. What is ease of doing business? It is just basically the idea that remove all obstructions to economic activity. Regulate the economic activity well, so that things like monopolies, and rent extraction does not happen, but remove all other obstacles to economic activity. That is what ease of doing business is. And this was, declared and postulated by Kautilya in the 2 millennia back, basically during the the Maurya Empire. This was the advice he used to give to Chandragupta Maurya to remove all obstructions to economic activity. And this work actually was quite influential in India, in its economic model till 12th century, which is basically acknowledged by Olivelle in this Oxford University Press book, published in 2013. If you look at not just in terms of the ideas, but what India did actually in enabling private enterprise. So a trade, or which is basically done by private actors, was a key contributor to ancient India's prosperity. Internal and external trade was done through 2 major highways: Uttara Patha, or the northern highway, and Dakshina Patha, or the southern highway. So India at that time had built these highways to enable trade. Not only inland trade was done like that, but there were ports that were connected, that connected India to Egypt, Rome, Greece, Persia, and Arabs to the west, and with China, Japan, and Southeast Asia to the east. So, this was also done to enable trade. So private enterprise that actually enabled trade was what India, focused enormously on historically. Trade was carried out by large corporatized guilds that are akin to today's multinationals. Today, we marvel at the Apples, the Microsofts of the world, but in India's history, these activities were carried out by corporatized guilds, which were funded by temple banks. And today now there's research emerging that temples were very important centers of economic activity, where money used to come in actually in the form of donations, and that used to be employed for funding these economic activities that were done by large corporatized guilds. And in fact, in the Arthashastra, the Kautilya says as well that basically specifies the duties of the king superintendent of commerce, which basically in today's world would be the commerce minister. And what does he say? He says mariners and merchants who import foreign merchandise shall be favored with remission of trade taxes so that they may derive some profit. Not only that, he would, Kautilya also mentioned that in the, urban planning, there should be quarters for foreign traders to come and stay as well, stay comfortably, so that they are attracted to come and actually sell their wares to Indian customers. So wealth and commerce actually were quite intrinsic to India's DNA, and India actually did build the infrastructure to enable this kind of trade. Now I talked about the hand of ethics, and this is very important because in the Indian thought it was recognized very well that the hand of ethics or dharma was very important to avoid matsya nyaya. Matsya nyaya, matsya means basically in Sanskrit means fish, nyaya is law, which is symbolic of the law of the jungle. But when you think about Matsya Nyaya, the big fish eat the small fish. That is basically the law of the jungle, and that creates a lot of negative externalities as well. So the Indian thought was very much aware that laissez-faire would lead to Matsya Nyaya, and therefore it is important to actually regulated, but by aspiring to dharma at the individual level, and also for the king to actually enforce laws to foster dharma in society. Tiruvalluvar in the Tirukural, actually this is verse 754, he says, and look at and focus on this, basically says, wealth yields righteousness and joy, the wealth acquired capably without causing any harm. He's very clearly saying that wealth that you basically go and acquire by maybe, polluting rivers or polluting the environment, that obviously causes harm. So he's saying, create wealth, but create wealth not by causing harm to others. So, things like pollution, externalities due to climate change, actually where, obviously they were not phenomena that were there at that time, but the concept of basically, of not causing harm was very much there. In fact, today as well, if you, those of you who can, relate to this, if you go to, to the altar of your home, many times you will find these two words written in the altars at our homes, which is Shubh Labh. We don't go and write there basically, Shubh Hani, nor do we go and write Ashubh Labh, right? Shubh means basically auspicious. Labh means profit. And how is it? Basically, this is, if you think about it a little bit more deeply, this part of culture that has come to us is because of some deep thinking that was done, examples of which I've given to you today. So we write Shubh Labh, we don't write, we don't say profit is a dirty word, we write Labh actually. And nor do we say that we, make profit in any which way and say, Ashubh Labh. We write Shubh Labh, and which actually conveys this symbiotic relationship between making profit but doing good, or moral capitalism. In fact, actually, to give credit where it is due, even Adam Smith, and this is something that the West has unfortunately forgotten. If you go and read his 1759's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith basically says, combine moral living and reasonable, look at what I put it on red, reasonable pursuit of material desires. Not the credo of greed is good, as the New York Times proclaimed in 1980s, or the model of rapacious capitalism that you see today, that make wealth at any cost. It was basically about moral living. And I think this is an aspect that's very, very important. When I reflect on economics, and having actually now learned economics and done research, when I reflect on overall, where the modern economics profession is, that basically, there is value neutrality. And I think when one thinks about economics as a part of society and how it should contribute to society, I actually think that this is something that the economics profession itself has to be thought about. And Indian thinking, actually Indian thought always, thought about it, and basically thought about dharma as actually the way of enabling virtue, enabling morality in society. And I think, the fact that things like the global financial crisis, the Indian banking crisis, clearly illustrate the importance of dharma. Why? Because in having done some of my work, some of my research has been in the world of incomplete contracts. The 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics was given to Oliver Hart for his work on incomplete contracting. Now, basically, what Oliver Hart showed was that real world contracts are intrinsically incomplete. And because real world contracts are intrinsically incomplete, you cannot actually, just through incentives, for instance, you cannot really, sort of take care of the first best outcome. In economics, we always have what a social planner would want, the first best outcome. And especially intrinsic motivation, often there is a lot of research in economics that also shows that many times actually incentive contracts can drive away, can crowd out intrinsic motivation. And the concept of dharma, in contrast, actually does not suffer from these problems. And that is why I think, this is something that really helped in Indian thought, was intrinsic to Indian thought. In fact, today, if you look at research after the global financial crisis, my PhD advisor, Luigi Zingales, has been at the center of a lot of this research. He basically talks about global financial crisis as a failure of trust. And, basically trust as a mechanism itself, if you dig a little deeper, ethical behavior is what leads to trust. If you think about model trust as a repeated game, there's work in economics that does that as well. And this is the second key part. So to summarize, I've talked about 5 pillars. I've spoken about 2 pillars so far. First was private enterprise, and markets. Second was sustainable growth, not rapacious capitalism, or second, moral capitalism, or sustainable growth. Third is wealth and wealth creation. And here, if you look at, basically, as I mentioned, the Rig Veda is the oldest text that is known to mankind. A hymn that comes in the Rig Veda is Sri Suktam, which is basically a hymn to worship the goddess of wealth, Mahalakshmi. Mahalakshmi, all of you would know, is basically known as the goddess of wealth. And in this, in the Sri Suktam, there is a part that comes in the end. It says, Dhanyam Dhanam Pashum Bahuputra Labham Shata Samvatsaram Dirghamayu. That is basically the benediction, the blessings that is being given. Dhanyam is basically cereals. In an agrarian society, that was important. Dhanam, which is actually wealth, or maybe gold coins. Dhanyam, Dhanam, Pashum. Again, in an agrarian society, cattle was important. So the blessing of cattle, the Pashum. Bahuputra Labham, actually, again, given mortality being very high at that time, many kids was also actually a blessing that was given. And finally, long life. Shata Samvatsaram Dirghamayuhu, basically long life extending up to 100 years. These are all, none of this is about afterlife. This is all about actually living life well here and now in this life. And that is basically something that the Rig Veda, the oldest text known to mankind, actually talks about. And Tirukkural, as I said, actually, around 300 BC, talked about this as well, that wealth, the lamp unfailing, speeds to every land, dispersing darkness at its Lord's command. This is not a culture that basically says, wealth is a dirty word, or profit is a dirty word. This is what is our culture. Verse 759, make money, there is no weapon sharper than it to sever the pride of your foes. So practical, if you think about it, even today, I think is equally applicable. Make money, there is no weapon sharper than it to sever the pride of your foes. Spoken about almost 2300 years back. And words, in the 104th chapter, verse 1040, Mother Earth will laugh at the prospect of those who plead poverty but lead an idle life. And I think, again, Purushartha is something that, or hard work is something that is being basically talked about here 2300 years back. As I mentioned, profit was never a dirty word. So this is basically what, the Indian thought has been of worshipping wealth, but wealth, made through good means, ethical means, dharmic means. And dharma, by the way, actually is seen as not a religious connotation, but basically the immutable laws of the universe. So, making wealth while respecting the immutable laws of the universe. Now, last two aspects which I'm going to focus on, which is property rights and also the role of the state, taxes, etc. Now, here I want to distinguish, the thought that came about on property rights in the West vis-a-vis what prevailed in India. And as I mentioned earlier as well, a capitalistic society, at the core of it is property rights. It's only in socialistic society where basically property rights are not respected. So now look at the contrast here. The Western principle of eminent domain. Eminent domain actually means, sort of a kind of sovereignty, allows governments to confiscate land from landowners. It's an eminent domain itself is a Latin phrase that means supreme lordship or ultimate sovereignty of God. Roman law and Magna Carta of 1215 AD recognized eminent domain for the state. In other words, basically what this gave is that the state can go and grab land at the pretext of development, or maybe just in a rapacious manner. Eminent domain gave that right to the state, and thereby basically justified rapacious behavior, by the state. In contrast, the Shukla Yajurveda in the 40th chapter basically says that even king must not appropriate others' wealth. So others' wealth, a person's wealth is his property. King cannot go and appropriate. That is basically respect of private property rights. Similarly, sage, Narada, I'm sure many of you basically would have, Narada Muni, many of you would have heard about, if not from your parents, from your grandparents. In his Dharma Shastra, which is called Narada Smriti, he says that the householder's living space and his field are considered as the fundamentals of his existence. Therefore, let not the king take either of them, for that is the root of householder. Again, respect of private property. In fact, adhering to this principle, Gautami Putra Satkarni, who basically was Satavahana dynasty's emperor, who ruled in India in the 1st century, he actually bought a tract of land, did not use the concept of eminent domain, saying, I am the emperor, and therefore, eminent domain gives me the right to go and confiscate land, as, Roman law and Magna Carta you basically enabled the Western society to do. No, he basically went and bought a tract of land along these lines. And that basically tells you that property rights, which, as I said, if you go and read a lot of the economics literature as well, it is at the heart of actually of capitalistic society, a society that enables private enterprise or encourages private enterprise. And that was actually part of Indian thought. Finally, when a few more thoughts on basically on the role of state, capital, etc. Look at the ideas on capital. And again, in a capitalistic society, capital itself is regarded as very important. When you think about production functions in economics, you have labor, capital, and you have total factor productivity. On capital, what was Indian thought? In the Shanti Parva in Mahabharat, it basically, book 12, chapter 8 says, wealth brings about accession of wealth, the way domesticated elephants are used to capture wild elephants. So, current wealth brings about more wealth. So, future wealth is basically equated with wild elephants. Current wealth is equated with domesticated elephant. So the way domesticated elephants are used to capture wild elephants, current wealth can actually bring about more wealth as well. So this was basically the idea that wealth is important to put into production to generate more future wealth. In contrast, a very, very a tall scholar whom actually all of us have enormous respect for, Aristotle, said that money is barren and cannot produce money. Look at the important difference basically in the, in the way wealth was thought about in Indian thought vis-a-vis the way it was actually thought in the Western paradigm. In fact, actually capturing the idea that wealth, has potential to generate more wealth, the grammarian Panini, who's basically the person to have created Sanskrit grammar, expressed interest payments in percentage terms in 700 BCE. That's about 2,700 years back. Now remember, today we basically take percent, which is per 100, as basically part of our, as common parlance. But 2,700 years back, he basically expressed interest payment saying, if you borrowed 100 rupees, this is the interest you will pay, which is the idea of rental cost of capital. That if you basically, because capital today can actually generate capital in future. So when I give you my capital, there is an opportunity cost and you have to pay me for that opportunity cost. And that is what Panini did in expressing interest payments 2,700 years back. So look at the money is barren and cannot produce money vis-a-vis wealth. Current wealth leads to future wealth, and therefore the rental cost of capital, which is interest payments. Look at the important distinction here. So capital and rental cost of capital, and therefore the importance of capital itself was part of India's DNA. Property rights I've talked about capital as well, which again tells you how private enterprise and capitalism was what was India's DNA. If you look at the state taxes and role of state taxes itself, again you see the difference between rapacious capitalism, the way it has gotten imbibed in the West, vis-a-vis the Indian model of moral capitalism. So this is a quote from the Mahabharat Shanti Parva, where he's basically it said that a king should tax his kingdom like a honey bee gathering honey from flowering plants. This is basically the metaphor. Now, honeybee, we all know, when it goes and collects honey from a plant, it cross-fertilizes in the plant in the process, and therefore this is a metaphor of give and take. Similarly, Kalidasa, most of us would know about Kalidasa. Those of us who studied in CBSE would have actually learned his poems as well. Sanskrit classes, if you took Sanskrit. The famous poet Kalidasa in Raghuvamsam basically says that the state collects tax for the greater welfare of its citizens, in the same way as sun evaporates water to form clouds, only to return it manifold in the form of rain. So evaporates some water to form clouds, but returns it back manifold in the form of rain. Look at the metaphor here, one that is symbiotic between the state and its citizens. and contrast it to this quote by Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was the finance minister of French King Louis XV, and he coined this, this metaphor for taxation, which said the art of taxation consists in plucking the goose so as to procure the largest quantity of feathers with the least possible hissing. Again, just contrast the metaphors. Let me pluck as many feathers as possible while making the the goose the least. So basically, extract as much as possible while trying to make sure that it does not hiss that much and trouble me. That's the concept of taxation there. Look at that, that the similes. It's simile of plucking the goose is exploitative. Simile of honeybee and cloud capture the symbiotic relationship. Unfortunately, today a lot of our thought is actually lost a lot of the very profound thinking that basically India had in its DNA. And part of my effort is basically to try and bring some of these back, through scholarly research. So similarly, if you basically look at, Mahabharata, again, in this Sabha Parva, Sage Narada asks King Yudhishthira, saying, have large water tanks been constructed at periodic distances to tackle water scarcity in the rain-fed areas of the country? So this is basically public good, water tanks as public good. Narada asking the king. Tirukural, actually, something I referred to, mentions that the power of those who perform penance is the power of enduring hunger. It is inferior to the power of those who remove the hunger. So again, actually, the activities of removing hunger, being placed on a higher pedestal than those that actually perform penance while enduring hunger. So, aspects of public goods and actually public service being talked about in Indian thought. So I'll end with a couple of more slides. There are more slides, but in the interest of time, I'm going to I'm going to stop with just a couple of slides. I think it is important to understand why India went after 1750, why India went the way it did. I think imperialist era policies actually were ones, the British policies were ones that really undermined markets. Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt have written about it extensively, that British economic policies distorted markets in Britain's favor at India's expense. They imposed tariffs that favored British exports at the expense of Indian entrepreneurs. The exchange rate was kept artificially tilted so that the trade surplus could go to Britain. In the way today, for instance, if you look at the US-China trade war, when US accused China of actually keeping its exchange rate artificially low to actually enable exports. So similarly, Britain did that, and many scholars have written about this British era. On the one hand, they actually undermined markets, but on the other hand, look at the hypocrisy, and something which oftentimes I'm actually not surprised by, given the current Ukraine crisis and actually some of the quantifications that come as well, on India's stance in the UN. Faced with famine, they rationalized non-intervention, saying intervening would violate principles of free trade and free enterprise. And I think the hypocrisy here is basically not even surprising me. So on undermining of markets and trade, not enabling markets and trade on the one hand led to the economic decline, but they basically rationalized not intervening when there was a famine based on principles of free trade and free enterprise. And I think that basically sort of captures the duplicity and the undermining of markets that led to India's decline. After independence as well, and I think again there's a lot of scholarly work now. Arvind Virmani, former CEA, has written extensively on this, basically saying that slow GDP growth for 40 years up until 1991 was due to the all-pervasive state control and command shackling economy. Many very, very deep thinkers like C. Rajagopalachari, B.R. Shenoy, etc., actually warned at that time against the dangers of the socialist model. They advocated the model of private enterprise, competition in markets, as was being pursued by Japan, France, and West Germany, and look where they are today. But they were not listened to. In fact, Milton Friedman actually, had visited both India and Singapore. He delivered a talk at the Planning Commission, his talk just remained a talk, never got implemented. In contrast, he went to Singapore, there his ideas were implemented, and look where Singapore is today. And in India, in contrast, his talk just remained talk, and profit was decreed as a dirty word. In fact, the economic idea of socialism itself was an imported idea. As I mentioned, it is not it's antithetical to India's DNA, which enabled private enterprise, as I just mentioned. So I'll stop here. And then there are more slides actually about the current fiscal policy, which I don't have time to go over. But let me just quickly summarize. If we have time, I might go, maybe in Q&A we might go through. In sum, India's tradition has been a very rich one of deep thought, reflecting liberalism and creativity. But liberalism defined not in the Western notion of separation of state from religion, but liberalism defined as, at the macro level of, infinite inclusiveness, and at the micro level, basically, action or allowing freedom of action based on one's temperament. And this kind of liberalism is what led to unparalleled creativity, and the economic ideas that evolved from this Indian thought was one of basically private enterprise, moral capitalism that led to unparalleled prosperity. As I showed, up until 1750 AD, India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP consistently for 17 and a half centuries. In other words, 3/4 of known economic history, India was by far the largest contributor to world GDP. And moving away from this DNA of moral capitalism is what has led to our decline during the imperialist era, and then after, actually, during the socialist period as well. And unfortunately, a lot of the residual of the socialist thinking still persists today. And I think it is important that we Indians go and learn what is our DNA. Now, of course, there is a conscious effort being made to go back to our DNA in the, several of the reforms that have been done, and the capital expenditure driven growth. So many of these are basically implementing ideas that were part of India's DNA. So I have no doubt that India at 100 beckons, and this decade will be a decade of unparalleled growth because of the reforms that were done during the COVID era. And I'll stop with that thought. While every other country in the world was just trying to scramble to get over the COVID period, India unleashed reforms during that period, and I had the privilege of being of participating in that reform process. So if you summarize, 1991 was product market reforms. This set of reforms are all factor market reforms, factor market of capital, labor, economies of scale, exports, etc. So that's basically what, which will lead to, very high growth in the coming decades. So India at 100 beckons. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you so much for the talk, Professor. We'll just get into questions if that's okay with you. We have quite a few. So the first question is, Professor, you talked about India's historic creativity and inclusivity. According to you, how can we today help our minority communities improve their economic conditions? And also, do you feel that the current reservation system is effective?
See, on the reservation system, I think we need far more research on. I will not speculate on that absent good evidence. I think there are clearly those that are being given reservations have been people who have been who have basically been deprived opportunity often. More than inequality of outcomes, inequality of opportunity is what oftentimes is actually the far more ethical wrong. And I think therefore, even if you look at in the United States, for instance, they do follow policies basically aimed at encouraging those that have been wronged against, for instance, the African Americans. So I think these are the second question on reservation is something that we need far more research on. I think the idea of giving reservations to those that are economically backward that was brought about by the current government is a good one, because we need to start refining some of the some of the policies so that those that are genuinely distressed get that reservation. As for the first question on minorities, I think, and this is something which I've looked at evidence. I'm yet to publish it because I'm sort of working on it. If I don't know how many of you recall, but in the 2021 economic survey, the last chapter there was access to basic necessities, access to the bare necessities. We developed an index of access to bare necessities, which included food, included clothing, good environment, housing, sort of mosquitoes, cleanliness, are they there? And we found there actually, and this is, by the way, not administrative data of the government, this is survey data, which is actually done by the NSO, and so independent of the government. We saw that access to bare necessities have actually improved for the minorities far more from 2014 to 2020 than in previous periods. And that's something which, this is evidence, by the way, and I think we have to be, one thing I do mention, science always evolves in a Bayesian manner, which is that, when we all have our priors, which is fine. But when we look at compelling evidence, basically we should look to update our priors. So that's the evidence. And I think if, those of us, especially from the elite, that basically say that, oh, the election outcomes are actually something that we cannot, we know, we are all educated people, we know how to vote, the others don't know how to vote. Basically, I think that conveys an arrogance that I think, which is basically completely misplaced. If we basically look at Indian electoral outcomes, governments that have not delivered have been booted out, and that is why the word in anti-incumbency. If there are governments that are coming back, and some of the evidence seems to suggest even because of some of the minorities basically supporting as well. I think this is something that is clearly has to be looked at. I would say there's more evidence that is required, more research that is required. Ideally, we should not be going by anecdotal evidence. I will point out one, at ISB, one of my colleagues has actually been doing some research looking at the coverage of violent incidents, when it involves a minority versus a majority community, and using text mining algorithms, etc. What is quite interesting, actually, I think it's still work in progress, which is if you basically read the English media and look at the same incident, that is the way it's reported in the vernacular media, you'll find that there is basically systematic differences. If it is basically a minority community, that was basically adversely affected, it's reported, actually the names are reported in the English media. But when it's the other way around, where it's actually the distressed section is a majority community, names are systematically taken out in the English reportage, while in the vernacular media it is reported as is. So these are aspects, again, that we need systematic research. Some of you who are actually interested in such research, we need to, I think, these opinions that we form, we must be forming it based on very careful research, not on anecdotes. And actually, that is a larger thought I want to leave you all with. When I read this very, very nice book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, a summarization that I did for myself was the difference between good thinking and bad thinking is all about 3 A's. Good thinking is about averages and aggregates. Bad thinking is about anecdotes often. So I think we have to be careful not just to basically, over-interpret anecdotes, look at aggregates and averages before. Now, aggregates and averages, by the way, are necessary, not sufficient for good thinking. But anecdotes are certainly, anecdotes neither fulfill the necessary condition nor the sufficiency condition for good thinking.
Thank you for that answer, Professor. We've got another question. You've quoted only Hindu Brahmanical texts as Indian thought. I have 2 questions. First, the idea of India did not exist until 2 centuries ago. In that much, how is this Indian thought and not Hindu thought specifically? Second, and relatedly, a large chunk of the period you quoted when India dominated the global economy, a large part of this land was ruled by non-Hindu rulers who may or may not have subscribed to the Hindu ideology that you have referred to as the Indian DNA. Can this ideology then be credited for all of India's historical economic prosperity?
So of course, this is a larger debate that we need to get into. I think I will not be able to do justice to this question in in the maybe minute or two that we have. And I think the idea of India, Bharatvarsh is actually has existed much longer. Of course, the India, the way it's defined in the constitution was done after independence. But for instance, and by the way, let me make it very clear. There is no Brahminical part to it. Vedas basically are not just ones that are basically for Brahmins. Let's be very clear. These basically have been. There are many scholars and saints who actually come from not non-Brahmins, who actually attained the pinnacle of wisdom from other communities. So I think this mischaracterization is something that we have to be very careful about. The Bhagavad Gita, which actually is one that I'm influenced by, it actually is a discussion between Krishna, who's basically supposed to be Yadava, and Arjuna, who's basically a Kshatriya. There is no Brahmin there. So I think let's be a little bit more careful in not trying to put caricatures that are actually not apt. And if anything, and by the way, that's the other thing. The Bhagavad Gita that I quoted liberally from actually is as applicable today as it was two millennia back, or maybe even beyond. So I think you have to be careful in not use your anecdotal evidence and the stereotypes that you formed in your mind actually peddle that as evidence. I think anecdotes have to be basically considered as anecdotes. Stereotypes should not be made based on anecdotes. So and this is something which see when we do in the in any sankalpa that is done in the this is of course I'm saying from the Hindu perspective. I will come to other thoughts as well. So when we do a sankalpa, we basically say, in Sanskrit, this is said, Mama Upatta, Samasta, Duradakshetva, Sri Parameshwar, like that it goes. And there it comes Bharata Varshe. It basically comes, so the word Bharata actually comes very much, there's the idea of India as a nation, India as a civilization, India as a society has existed long before, and actually that's something that has come to us. Now, as examples of other thought, I refer to I'll ask you to go and take a look at the economic survey, the 2018-19 economic survey, where we had quoted on this concept of willful default. Of course, in the Hindu scriptures, there's basically talk about how a loan is an obligation that has to be paid. It's very interesting, even in Christianity and in Islam, the idea of debt, something that has to be repaid, is talked about very well. For instance, in Islam, when a person passes away, there's this practice, where they come with basically before the last journey of that person, they'll come around with actually with a container having currency rupee notes saying, if this person borrowed some money from you, please take it now so that this person's last journey can be without debt. So this idea, as I said, has existed in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, but even in Islam. And similarly, Jesus has also talked about the debt of love, but don't ever have the debt of monetary debt, and saying monetary debt is basically something that is a sin. So ideas like these, I actually, given my exposure to this this literature, I've of course drawn far more from the Hindu scriptures. But I am equally, I'm equally confident that similar ideas will very well exist, in other religions. I am not a scholar in those others. Actually, I have not gone and read those, and that is why I have to actually acknowledge my limitation in not being able to draw on those. Wherever I have been exposed to those ideas, actually, I have drawn on that, as I give the example of the economic survey as well.
Thank you so much for that answer, Professor. Another question is, what is your view on human capital in India? Do you think we need more Indian economists trained in the Indian thought than in the Western thought? And are economic policies better planned if one contextualizes them in India than in Western case studies?
So I think let me be very careful here, right? So I don't want my talk to be mistaken, in any of the following ways. I think the Western rigor, which is something that I had the privilege of imbibing by studying at the University of Chicago, that rigor in research is actually something that is incredibly important. But at the same time, India's policies have to be actually catered to India's, socio-cultural and India's stage of development as well. I think just cut pasting stuff from other countries is not good. Using that rigorous method of research thinking, we have to basically think ab initio for what is right for India. Your question was posed in the context of human capital. Of course, I think, healthcare and education are two key areas that, matter for human capital, and something that we have to really, work on. Those of you who are interested in the 2021 economic survey, I think the fourth or the fifth chapter was on healthcare. If I remember right, the chapter in volume 1, the chapter was titled "Healthcare Takes Center Stage Finally." And I would refer you to that chapter to look at, not only did it analyze the status of healthcare, across the country, but also had a lot of solutions for how to, basically improve, the healthcare situation. And I think education, there's been a lot of work as well. I did not have the opportunity to write a chapter on education, but I think there's a lot of work that's been done on India especially on governance side. People like Karthik Muralidharan, for instance, have done good work in this, which you can go and refer to. And I think India definitely has to actually think far more about its human capital. I think it's a area which basically requires years of investment, but I think the returns do certainly come. When the returns come, the returns actually are disproportionate, are very high. But I think that is something which is very, very important, cannot be emphasized. I'm glad you asked that question. I'll end the response to the question by giving you, an example of, because you framed the second part of the question about thinking for India. And that's something which I was going to cover. Just quickly, I'll take you through a couple of slides on the Indian fiscal response. Let me just show this. So if you look at, before I share, let me just mention one thing. See, if you look at the inflation scenario, globally, compared to, let's take two crises. Let's take the global financial crisis. Let's take the COVID crisis. After the COVID crisis, Western economies have felt very high inflation. After global financial crisis, they didn't face it that much. India, in contrast, actually had very high inflation after the global financial crisis. Has had inflation that has been actually, has been range bound, has sometimes gone to 6.1%, 6.2%, etc., but has very much been range bound. So very high inflation during the global financial crisis, but low inflation, low to moderate inflation during the COVID crisis. West, on the other hand, low inflation during the global financial crisis, very high inflation now during the COVID crisis. For instance, having lived in the US, typically the US consumer expects an inflation of 2.5% maximum, but now they're actually encountering 7.5%, 7.5%. And after the global financial crisis, inflation had basically crashed. In fact, now why is this? Why is India's macro so different? Because India's policy response was not one that mimicked the Western response. And it's important to understand here that unlike the global financial crisis, which was a shock to demand, it really reduced demand. COVID crisis, on the other hand, was not only a shock to demand, it was also a big shock to supply. It reduced supply significantly as well. Supplies, chains got disrupted. And India's response actually, was very calibrated on the demand side. In the global financial, after the global financial crisis, we did only revenue expenditure for, and for instance, the egregious form of this was the farm loan waiver. And this was under an economist prime minister at that time, which led to inflation touching close to 17-18%, double-digit inflation, for 18 months. Now think about it counterfactually, and that's where let me bring in the, show you the chart, because that's something which will explain very well. So this is basically just sort of using a chart explaining. So let's say that this, so the solid lines are pre-COVID, okay? So there's demand and supply, okay? Now, what has happened actually because of COVID is that not only has demand reduced, and that's why the demand curve shifting, to the left, this demand curve here, but supply is also reduced. And so, now what Western economies have done is they've primarily focused a lot more on, on the demand side. So if you increase demand, actually, if you take the combination of the solid line for the demand and the dotted line for supply, you can see clearly reduced output but higher price, which basically translates into higher inflation. In contrast, what India, and this is basically explains what, the sort of the importance of looking at supply and demand both. So counterfactually, think about it, what India would have had if we had just followed the Western template of just doing demand side spending. Take the global financial crisis outcomes that resulted, double-digit inflation, touching 17-18%. Add to that the impact of reduced supply. So, India could have faced easily, double-digit inflation, possibly even touching 20% odd. In contrast, India has had inflation maximum 6.2, 6.3%. And to understand the impact of policy, you always have to look at the counterfactual. So what could have been if India had not thought, very carefully, and we went back to first principles and basically said, we have to think for India, on its own, rather than just mimicking the West. And that is why inflation has been actually so much in control, 6.2, 6.3% maximum. But that is with the huge supply side disruption. In contrast, so just look at the stats, right? Double-digit inflation, around average of 15% in the global financial crisis, 6% now, which is so 9% lower for India. What happened for the West? Inflation almost close to zero in the global financial crisis, 7% now. Increase of 7% there, decrease of 9% for us. That tells you why thinking ab initio, the rigor of Western thought, of basically Western methodology, but excellent understanding of the Indian ground realities and the Indian economic apparatus, I think is what has led to, this basically this spectacular performance on the macros, following the global financial crisis. And if you look at after the global financial crisis, there was a taper tantrum. India's was part of the fragile five. In contrast, after the COVID crisis, India has emerged compared to other countries, in a much stronger situation. That tells you the importance of the combination of rigor, at the same time, awareness of Indian realities.
Thank you for the response, Professor. I think we'll just take two more questions within the interest of time. The first one being, how can the government maximize the impact of its spending, given that its taxation already produces efficiency losses and costs the economy in the form of marginal cost of public funds? Further, how do we reduce the value of MCPF, marginal cost of public funds, for the Indian economy?
So, firstly, one of the key changes India did actually was reduce the corporate tax rate. In September 2019, we reduced the corporate tax rate significantly. So recognizing very well that, that at those level of taxes, the investment that we want to generate will not happen, and investment through that, the virtuous cycle, would not happen. And that's why we reduce the tax rate. So I think a reduction in tax rates, the factor market reforms that have been undertaken, emphasis on capital expenditure, especially public capex, all these are ways of actually improving the return on capital in the economy.
We'll just take one final question. So this is an anonymous question that's come in, and it says that from what I understand, that you are arguing that capitalism and the pursuit of profit is an Indian idea, and that socialism is a foreign import. Now, nobody is necessarily saying that Indian texts have argued for capitalism or against socialism. However, Indian socialism is not necessarily also claiming that it draws legitimacy from ancient scriptures. Indian socialism is partly necessary because the ancient capitalism that has been referred to in the text that you mentioned has led to deprivation and economic deprivation and oppression in the form of the caste system. The point is, why is something ancient and inherent better than something that can potentially alleviate the oppression that the ancient has created?
No, I think let me be very clear here, right? I did cover that the fact that, during the imperialist era and socialist era, we actually undermined markets. We went away from our DNA. And let me be very clear, what India is now implementing is, taking those ideas, but to the Indian reality today. As I just gave you the example of the response to the COVID crisis, we have basically recognized what is important for India today. But I think the response that I don't think socialism anywhere has actually delivered prosperity. I think if you look at China, moved away from its socialist policies. We've seen basically the breakup of USSR, the entire communist bloc. And I think, if you look at socialism, I think it basically undermines two key aspects that are at the heart of prosperity, and welfare in society, which is private enterprise, the desire for a person to work hard for him to improve his or her, situation, compete with others. Basically, I think these ideas are central to, if you look at, for instance, take your own example, you guys have actually come to a university like Ashoka University, having competed with the best. If suppose Ashoka University were a free for all, would you guys basically be, there was no test, anybody, that's what socialism is, right? That you basically don't, everybody gets the same outcome. And I'll give you a specific example that because I think this captures, if you're interested, take a look at the presentation on the 2021 economic survey, and the video on a chapter on inequality itself. And those who are interested, by the way, go and read a chapter. I think this chapter 3 or chapter 4 in the 2021 economic survey on inequality and growth. Are they in conflict or convergence in the Indian context? So let me give you this example. There's a show called Malgudi Days. We used to watch when we were kids. So I'm going to give you the story on socialism, versus basically capitalism using this story. So in one of the episodes, the central character there, Swami, comes back from from school, crying to his mother, saying that that I scored 100 out of 100 in mathematics, but the principal took away 20 marks from me and gave it to Shankar, who got 60 out of 100, because the principal wanted to equalize, wanted equality. So Shankar got only 60 marks out of 100. I got 100 out of 100. The principal basically took 20 marks away from me and gave it to Shankar, so that both of us get 80. Swami basically cries and says that, I'm not going to work hard anymore, because 80 anyway, I don't need to work at all. I will get 80 actually without doing any work at all. And so he says that, my incentive to work hard to get 100 is gone completely. Shankar, on the other hand, goes very, very happy, and basically tells his mother, I'm not going to study anymore, because anyway, I'm going to get 20 marks grace. So what's the big deal? Why should I don't, need 80 marks, 20 marks anyway, I'm going to get, I'm not going to work hard. So the good kid who basically, was getting 100, now gets 80. The kid that does not work hard, basically his incentive to work hard basically was not there earlier, has gotten even more dampened. But the bright kid's incentive has also gone down. And actually, there is a tweet. If you go to my Twitter handle, you'll see, if you implement this in your own class, if any professor implements it, saying, irrespective of how much ever hard you guys work, I will give all of you a B+ in the class. You will see that is basically socialism. What will happen? Those who actually get A's in the class will have no incentive to work hard. The A rankers basically will be the ones that will stop working. Those who get C's in the class will basically have anyway no incentive, actually, because they're going to get B+ as well. That is socialism for you. Capitalism, on the other hand, is actually competition. You guys are at Ashoka University, having competed with the best and having come to Ashoka because of competition. Those that did not make it, basically it's maybe 10 times that. If those guys were sitting in your class, because of the model of socialism, I will then ask you how you will respond. They may be asking questions, they may not be understanding, and thereby wasting your time. That would be the model of socialism. Think about it, reflect on it, and then actually again, reflect on this question.
Thank you for your insights, Professor. It's been a wonderful talk. I'll just hand it over to Aviral for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor, for taking our time to for this talk. We are truly grateful for the opportunity and all the insights we have learned today. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We'll share the recording because we have the permission from the professor. And finally, thank you to all the members of the Economic Society for working hard to make this happen. We hope to see you soon, Professor.
Thank you so much again, Professor.